Good evening, and welcome to the first installment of WorldDenver's Race and Justice in World Affairs series. My name is John Krieger. I'm the Executive Director of WorldDenver. For those of you who are new to WorldDenver, and I'm excited to say there are many of you this evening, WorldDenver is an organization that facilitates international exchange and global engagement. In a typical year, we bring about 600 international visitors to Denver to exchange ideas and expertise from around the world. Of course, this is not a typical year, but we are continuing to keep up global conversations and international exchange in virtual and online platforms. And there's really been two conversations that have dominated global dialogue over the last several months. One has been around public health, the spread of infectious disease, and COVID-19. The other is a conversation that impacts public health. It impacts criminal justice, economic justice, education, and really every aspect of American life. And that's the continued pursuit of racial justice and equity. And as an organization, WorldDenver, our staff, our board, and our volunteer speaker committee have made a commitment to be active participants in that conversation, to do so through a global lens, and to do so in a real and meaningful way. So we'll be discussing race and justice in world affairs over August and September, and we are so fortunate with our first event to have Ambassador Charles Ray. Ambassador Ray is someone whose biography, as impressive as it is, shows a deep commitment to service to the United States, whether as a soldier and as a U.S. Army officer for 20 years, as a diplomat for 30 years. Ambassador Ray was the first ever Consul General to Ho Chi Minh City, was ambassador to Cambodia and ambassador to Zimbabwe. Really, honestly, this is just the tip of the iceberg with Ambassador Ray's biography, which also includes an accomplished author, artist, I think former journalist, and maybe editorial cartoonist as well. Ambassador Ray, we are so thankful to have you with us this evening. We're also thankful to have another ambassador, Ambassador Catherine Ebert-Gray, to be our facilitator and moderator. Ambassador Ebert-Gray also has a lifetime commitment to service to the United States through the Foreign Service, most recently as the ambassador to Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. And she is now the Director of Global Education for CU Denver. And I should say we are so fortunate and thankful for our continued and growing partnership with CU Denver. So I'm going to hand things over to our ambassadors for their conversation. Before I do, I will just remind folks that we will spend the second part of our program this evening answering your questions. So if you have questions for either of the ambassadors, you can feel free to enter those by clicking on, you'll see a small question mark icon. Click on that icon and you can submit the questions. When I come back in about 35 to 40 minutes, we'll spend the latter portion trying to answer as many of those questions as we can. But without any further ado, I will hand the virtual stage over to our ambassadors and do so in saying thank you so much for being with us this evening. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to everyone for joining us, and a very warm welcome to Ambassador Ray. Just by way of introduction, I want to say, of course, that the defense of human rights is still a cornerstone of our U.S. foreign policy, and ethnic and racial identity is often at the root of atrocities around the world, which is why it's so important that this continue to be a high priority. And as the Department of State wrestles with how to address these issues, often with very limited resources, we can all agree that one of the most effective tools that we have to represent our values is to identify and equip people who reflect our diverse nation. Interestingly, while the U.S. military service is comprised of over 16% Hispanics and 18% African Americans, our diplomatic corps has less than 5% Hispanics and about 8% African Americans. This compares to a U.S. population as a whole of 14% African Americans and 15% Hispanic. So our diplomatic corps, while it's a priority, has a ways to go. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with Ambassador Ray, who has overcome institutional bias throughout his career, and a brilliant career at that. And I'm certain you're going to enjoy getting to know him too. So let's get started. Ambassador, our childhood is like a blueprint for our lives. It shapes how we think, how we act, and how we interact. Can you start by telling us about your early life and influences growing up in Shelby County, down in Texas?
Yeah, although I would say that probably the most significant influence on my growing up was not so much being in Shelby County as it was being in my grandmother's house. I was raised from the time I was about 11 or 12 until I graduated from high school and joined the Army by my grandmother, who'd been born just a few years after the end of the Civil War, actually. About 4 feet 11 inches tall, weighed maybe 85 pounds, and as tough as leather, a force of nature. Educated herself, taught herself to read and write. And as she used to tell me, I taught myself to do, as she would say, sums, so people couldn't cheat me when I go to the store. And she taught herself to read using the Bible and a Sears and Roebuck catalog. But and she basically, being a self-made woman, she was the type, basically taught me to decide for myself who I was and what I wanted to be, which was actually somewhat dangerous in East Texas at the time I grew up in the 40s and 50s, because I grew up in a small town of about 700 or so people that was roughly 50% white, 50% African American. And I tell people this and they laugh because they think I'm making it up. We had segregated parking. I mean, there were parts of town that were reserved for certain people to park. And if you took your life in your own hands parking in the wrong place. So being taught to be self-reliant and independent wasn't exactly safe, but her view was, you have to be this way or you belong to other people. If you're going to be a human being who lives a life that you want to live, you have to live it on your own terms. And of course, because I was a bit of a loner growing up, I mean, I basically, my idea of fun was to get a book and a backpack and a bottle of water and go into the forest behind our house and sit and watch the animals and read. I didn't really like being around people very much, so I managed to survive until I got out of Texas. And it's sort of interesting in a way when you say you're shaped by your environment. I mean, I grew up in a rural town where the topic of conversation was what the football team is doing and how the weather is and how it affects your crops. I had a love of reading in a school where no one liked reading if they didn't have to. I liked nature, which earned me some rather nasty nicknames growing up. And I really didn't like being around people. And in a small country town, if you're a loner, you're automatically marked as, I guess the way to put it is, there's a Native American custom is that you don't mess with crazy people because they're touched by the Great Spirit. And I think that growing up, that was me. I was the town crazy, so everyone just basically left me alone. And that was, and so those are the factors that shaped me. Learning to be by myself, to do things for myself, and with a grandmother who taught me to write my own story. Don't let someone else write it. That's other than that, growing up in a small East Texas farm town, what can I say? An exciting Saturday was to go up to the train yard, get on top of the grain elevator, and throw gravel at trucks.
Never underestimate the power of grandparenting, huh? I know my grandma was a librarian, so like you, is reading, reading, reading. And you know, I recall you telling me once before that you actually became the school president, which just lets you know leadership can emerge at any age and at any level. So it's done you well. And in fact, Charlie, you are one of the few people who have had a full career with both the Department of Defense and the Department of State. And while the two departments generally work well together, especially in recent years, there's still two very different institutional cultures. Can you reflect on racial issues and inclusion in these two major US institutions and why many of us feel that our defense partners do a better job in integrating and retaining minorities?
Yeah, I think the difference is that the military in general is very much a mission-oriented hierarchy where everyone knows where they stand in the organization, and there are rules for everything. And while there is still, or was during my time, and I think it exists still as a four-star general who's a friend of mine said recently, to expect that attitudes that exist in a general society don't also exist in the military is foolish. They are there, but the military, being the hierarchical, structured organization that it is, has better ways of dealing with it, and there are more remedies when you encounter bias. State Department, on the other hand, and I love the State Department. I enjoyed my 30 years, but it's like a Cub Scout troop. It has the uniforms, but everyone is doing their own little thing, and there is really little in the way of a structure. I think our focus on diplomacy being the long-term maintenance of relationships has sort of infiltrated the institutional idea. It is very hard in state to get people to be mission focused, and therein actually lies the conflict between state and DoD. The military comes in with a mission and they want to get it done, and the state people come in with I'm here and I'm going to do what I do until I leave and turn it over to someone else. But there's also fewer, at least in my observation, fewer institutional mechanisms within state to deal with bias. I mean, we have the rules and regulations that every government department has, but there's really no teeth. I mean, in the military, if you violate the rules, you can be court-martialed, you can be relieved of duty. A lot of bad things can happen to you if you break the rules. In state, you break those rules and it becomes so difficult to actually get any kind of action taken, and particularly if it's sensitive or if it's a matter of conflict, that it sort of just floats there. I remember when I was in Sierra Leone back in 1993 to 1996 as deputy chief of mission, and I had a general services officer specialist who worked, and he was the husband of one of our office management specialists, and he was a nice guy, but he had this sort of big Bawana attitude toward our Sierra Leonean staff, and he would occasionally talk to them in ways that they found very demeaning and upsetting, but of course they wouldn't say anything. And no one had ever called this person in and said, you don't do that. And one day my office overlooked the street, and I happened to be standing near the window for some reason, and I looked down and I saw this guy on the sidewalk with a line of about 50 visa applicants standing nearby, screaming at one of our employees. I mean, just literally waving his finger in his face and treating him like he'd like a dog who had just gone on your best rug. And when I called, went down quietly, asked him if he'd follow me to my office so we could have a talk, I was actually looked at funny by many of the other Americans in the embassies. You know, why would you embarrass one of the American staff like that? Of course, you know, being the DCM, it doesn't matter because I just tell them to shut up and go back to your office. But the point was that it was to avoid conflict between Americans. People seemed willing to tolerate the most outrageous. I mean, you know, when I was in the military, if a sergeant was doing that outside of training, where they do it as a sort of a training thing, but in a regular unit, if someone did that in public, he would be in the commander's office with his shoulders back and hands at his side, being dressed down, and if he was lucky, that's all that would happen to him. I don't really know what the answer is to these differences, other than there's just a difference in the two I recently did an article for a magazine on, I call it Realigning Mars and Venus, and how to rebalance or get the proper balance between state and defense in conducting foreign affairs. And it's just that they are two very different organizations with two very different worldviews, and we don't spend enough time getting to know each other so that we can, to use a bureaucratic term, deconflict those worldviews or get them to mesh.
How interesting to hear your perspective on that. Of course, you and I are management cones, so we're used to having a little more structure and rules and regulations and management oversight. But wait till you go to work at a university, and the State Department will look quite disciplined. Just kidding, university. It's actually been quite interesting to see how other organizations work, because you're right, the State Department's quite fluid that way. Now, I've certainly noticed, and being an ambassador twice is just very rare. So you've done a tremendous job of building bridges very successfully across your whole career. After a few years in the Foreign Service, they actually returned you then to Vietnam as a Consul General, and you had served there during the Vietnam War. So can you tell us more about that experience and, you know, the importance of those global friendships that you were able to further nurture?
Well, yeah, going back to Vietnam was an interesting experience, because when I went back as Consul General, it was in fact the first time that I'd been back in the country since I left in 1973 after the ceasefire. There was a double shock for me. One, because I had to go to Hanoi first, and flying into Hanoi was an experience, because at that point in time, this was 1998, they hadn't built the new airport there, so you had these sheds, and you know, a lot of the luggage was taken off and stacked on platforms under a tin roof outdoors. So you had these little guys in uniforms and with guns running around all over the place. And that was a bit unsettling at first, until I realized that was just the way they did things. And then the second shock came after I did my consultations at the embassy to get on the plane and fly to Ho Chi Minh City. As we were coming in for our landing that evening, I looked out the window of the plane as we're making the final approach at Tan Son Nhut, and off to my right, the old concrete revetments that we parked our helicopters and aircraft in when I was there in the 60s and 70s were still there. It was an almost surreal feeling. It was like we've gone through a time warp. We're back. This is the Saigon I remember from the 60s and 70s. Then of course we got off the plane, and that vanished, because it had completely changed. What was most amazing to me, though, I think, was the reception I got from the Vietnamese officials. These were all Communist Party members. Many were former Viet Cong. In fact, the mayor of Ho Chi Minh City was a Viet Cong ammunition battalion commander during the war, and he swears that one of the units that I served in spent a good bit of time trying to kill him. And we became golfing buddies and drinking buddies, and he used to tell people he was really glad that I was an inefficient, I was in intelligence, and that I was not very good at my job because we were never able to pin him down because he wouldn't have had me as a friend. But it was interesting because the Vietnamese, I discovered, were a lot more, their ability to put the war behind them and to move forward was much better than ours. I mean, it was unbelievable. A lot of the people of my generation who'd been involved in the war had a hard time going to Vietnam, had a hard time dealing with the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese were, hey, you know, as my friend the mayor would say, we've been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years. We fought the French for 100 years. We only fought you guys for 10 years. It's no big deal.
Oh, that's a good story. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. Charlie, you know, we've all been reading a lot more about racism in America recently, and I was quite struck when I read about our colleague, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley recently, and she said that she feels more American when she's living overseas than she does when she's living here in the United States. And other African-American diplomats said that they could really relate to that comment. Now, since you are both members of the American Academy of Diplomacy, could you tell us a little bit more about the letter that the Academy sent to Secretary Pompeo, urging the Department of State to address the mistreatment of minority episodes at the border? And what were some of your own experiences coming in and out of our country?
Well, on the letter, that letter grew out of the experience of the young lady at one of our border consulates in Mexico who suffered serial mistreatment by the immigration people on the border as she drove back across the border. And it was basically a letter to the Secretary of State expressing our view as an academy that this is absolutely intolerable. That we're not asking for special treatment for American Foreign Service people, but courteous treatment. I mean, and also it because she was carrying a diplomatic passport. It's an insult. I mean, it's one arm of the American government basically completely insulting and disregarding the documents of another, which is just, you expect this in third world countries. You don't expect this in a country, at our level. And when I read her account, at first I was just furious. I mean, I was so upset I had to stop reading and go to my garage and smoke my pipe for an hour just to calm down, because I was sort of asking myself, how can this still be happening in 2020? Because it brought to mind some of my own experiences coming back to the U.S. as a diplomat, including a couple of trips back to the U.S. as an ambassador. And as you know, when you're an ambassador, the back of your passport has a stamp in it that says the bearer of this passport is the United States ambassador to. And I guess it just sort of struck me that these, and I actually use the term institutional bias rather than institutional racism, because it's not just people of color. I mean, we have biases against people with disabilities, religious, I mean, you name it. Women get treated worse than men, and so on. But in the example, or I guess I should say the two incidents that popped into my mind. One, when I was ambassador to Cambodia, and I was flying to Hawaii for a conference. We were having a chief of mission conference in Hawaii, and I come in on the red-eye flight, arriving from Tokyo at like 6 in the morning. I don't sleep well on planes, so I really wasn't in the best of moods when I got into the airport. I get into the airport. Not many Americans were on my flight, mostly Japanese. I get into the immigration line. I get up to this young lady. I give her my passport, black passport, ambassador to Cambodia. I look like my photo in the passport. Probably 10 or 15 diplomatic visas and stamps, because I did a lot of traveling when I around Southeast Asia. She starts to interrogate me, and I use the term interrogate deliberately. I was a counterintelligence officer in the Army, and I know an interrogation when I see one. I answered about 4 or 5 questions, and then I asked her politely, "Why are you asking me all these questions?" She looked at me with a complete blank expression and said, "I wanted to make sure you speak English." And, you know, when I picked my jaw up off the floor, I thought, uh-oh, I got one of those. And I decided to try and, you know, lighten the tone, lower the temperature. So I asked it, "Well, did I pass?" You know, and she says yes. And I said, "Well, that's good, because I'm from Texas and people really think we people from Texas don't speak English very well." She didn't laugh. She just sort of flipped my passport back to me, didn't even say, "Welcome to the US." Glad to be out past that. And it's, you just have to ask. I mean, I've got a United States passport, a diplomatic passport. Why would I not speak English? You know, what's the assumption being made there that I'm going to try to sneak into the US on a diplomatic passport claiming to be an ambassador? How easy is that to check? I mean, you know, use your head. And then the other incident that popped into my head was when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Still traveled on a diplomatic passport, and at the Pentagon, no one called me Deputy Assistant Secretary. Everybody called me Ambassador. They loved having an ambassador there. I was invited to Colombia by the President of Colombia to give a speech at a regional conference he was hosting. So with my Director of Personnel Recovery, who was an Air Force colonel, we flew down, did the conference. We're coming back. We land in Miami. I don't know, it's 8 or 7 or 8 at night. I don't remember, but it was night. And he and I are in the line, walking up to immigration. I've got my diplomatic passport. It's got a Colombian diplomatic visa in it. It had, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, I probably in 3 years, I think I went to 14 different countries. I used to go to a different country about every 4 months. So I had tons of visas in there. Give my passport, the colonel's behind me as we were walking through, and you know, he probably called me Mr. Ambassador about every 4th sentence. And he didn't have a quiet voice, so I know he could be heard well. I hand my passport to the immigration guy. He looks at me, he opens the passport, he does something on his little computer, puts my passport down, and says, "Just step over there." No explanation as to why. And then my colonel comes in up, he hands his red passport. He gets looked at, stamped, welcome home, and he's about to go through. He stopped, and I just sort of waved, you know, I don't know what's happening, but let's not make this guy think that we're going to gang up on him. I stand there for about 5 minutes. Finally, a supervisor shows up. The guy says something to him I couldn't hear, hands him my passport. He looks at me, he opens my passport, he closes my passport, he walks over to me, he hands me my passport and says, "Oh, sorry for the inconvenience." And that's it. He walks away. And I'm you know, I never knew what the devil was this all about. And, you know, I suppose I could have kicked up a fuss, but I don't think I would have won won that battle. I mean, they had badges and guns, and all I had was my righteous indignations. I mean, these type things come into your mind, and you can come up with a lot of this happened because, but when you sort of look around at the environment when they're happening, and unfortunately, sometimes there's only one answer that makes any sense, and you just sort of, I mean, I just tend to sort of shrug and say, well, in the bell curve of human distribution, they happen, unfortunately, to be in the lower part of the bell curve. There's not much I can do about that.
Well, it certainly sounds like it's long overdue that we make this an issue. And I hope that the Secretary takes it seriously and has conversations with the whole Department of Homeland Security. I know myself, I haven't had these kind of problems coming in out of the United States. Only one time did I have a series of questions, and that was in Australia, of all places. So I commend you for taking that up. And just today in a meeting, one of my university colleagues told me that one airport in particular, LAX, is particularly belligerent to our international students. And our international students are the ones that are helping us improve our relationships overseas, and they're contributing to our economy. And I'm very disappointed to hear that they're facing particular harassment there at LAX. So let's hope that movement of today permeates that culture too, and that we see a difference over the long term.
Well, until we get the leadership at the top of these organizations to take it seriously and take it on as something that they are interested in, you're not going to see any change. I mean, this is one of those issues where the change comes from the top. I mean, I've seen it in every organization that I've been in since 1962 when I joined the Army. The organization reflects the interest or disinterest of the person at the top.
They say culture is everything. Culture is everything. We need to change that culture with better leadership. So, Ambassador, to give us all some fresh talking points in our own attempts to produce change in America, we would love to hear your views on why addressing racism at home is so important to national security and foreign policy.
Well, let's just start with why we even integrated the diplomatic service, for example. If you go back in American history, the way we did diplomacy very much reflected sort of the attitudes within society. I mean, look at how long it took us to recognize Haiti's independence when they got their independence from France. The fact that it wasn't until 1875 or 1878 that a person of color was sent to Haiti as minister there, and that was by grant after the Civil War. Prior to 1875, our diplomatic service was entirely, and it wasn't just color bias. I mean, not only did they not send people of color abroad as diplomats, they only sent the wealthy elite. So we very much reflect, I think, the prevailing mood in society. And if you go back and you look at the history of the way people of color and women, I will have to say, I mean, you yourself probably know this. I mean, just like the vote, we got a break before you did. It was only when large numbers of the countries in Africa began to gain their independence that you really started to see an increase in the number of people of color in the diplomatic service. And for a long time, except for a few of the smaller posts in Europe that didn't count on anyone's strategic radar, Africa was the place of choice to post these people, or Haiti, and perhaps the Dominican Republic. And so that sort of shapes why is it important? Because we started to recognize that if you're a country that has a diverse population, but the people of another country only see one part of that demographic, they're going to get a distorted picture of who and what you are. They're also going to be a bit suspect of your policy pronouncements. I mean, we push countries on elections, we push countries on human rights and treatment of their own minority citizens, respect for rule of law. Well, we have to model the policies that we're trying to promote, and diversity, not just ethnic and racial diversity, but gender diversity, economic diversity, geographic diversity, has to be part of the structure, or it undercuts our whole message. It undercuts, I mean, it just knocks the foundation out from under the policies that we're trying to promote. And the other is it, I think, makes for a stronger, more adaptable, more resilient service. When you bring different attitudes to an organization, you bring more capability to that organization. So, I mean, I don't know, to me, it's a no-brainer. If you are a diverse country, then your organizations to other countries should reflect who you are. And if they don't, then people will not believe you when you say, we say, we tell other countries, we believe in human rights, we believe in rule of law, and then we don't model it. What's their reaction to our message? Yeah. So, I mean, that's a sort of a simple countrified way of putting it, but it's like my grandmother would say, what you do is so loud I can't hear a word you say.
Oh, I like that. I like that, Charlie. And of course, we just have to practice what you preach. How can we be talking about human rights? How can we talk about inclusion and equity? And how can we talk about opportunity if we don't practice it? And I know from my tour in the South Pacific, it was very hard to dance around the climate change issue when they were losing their shorelines, when crops were dying. And I had to relate how the American people felt because our policy had changed so much.
Yeah.
And when I think back,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it's like I went to Cambodia in 2002, right after the hanging Chad election of 2001. And Cambodia was getting ready to have its third ever election. And I was in a meeting on Capitol Hill, and one member of Congress, who I won't name, sort of pounded the table. So you got to tell those Cambodians that they've got to get this election right. And I wanted to say to him, I have to really be careful how I say that. They have TVs, they watch television, they know about the Florida election. So we shouldn't be quite so loud when we demand that other people do what we sometimes struggle to do ourselves. But you're right, you have to practice what you preach.
And we mostly only have words to use it with. We don't have that many tools.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, words are strong, but actions are stronger. And if you have the words, but you don't have the actions to back them up, words are cheap. You have to give value to the words with your actions.
That's true. That's so true. And when I look back at my years at the department, I realized that a number of my wisest and most influential supervisors and leaders were African American ambassadors or secretaries of state. Colin Powell taught us all to take care of our people at every level. And Ambassador Ed Perkins was my ambassador in Australia, and he came to country team and he expected us to understand the priorities of all the sections at the large embassy. And those are lessons that really stuck with me. So may I ask you, what strengths do you think African American leaders bring to senior positions in general?
Well, for my generation, I think what you bring, and there are of course exceptions to this, but in general, you bring empathy. I mean, you recognize, having been on the bottom of the totem pole for a long time, what it's like down there, and a caring person then relates to people in terms of, I don't want you to suffer like I did. You also, I think, and most of us, depending on what part of the country we come from, grew up in sort of a family-oriented environment where if you lived in a segregated neighborhood, you had to be self-reliant. Families and groups of families had to pull together. So you understand the value of cooperation. You understand the value of humility, and that people above all want to feel respected. And if people feel that you respect them, they will return it, and they will put out for you. And then add to it, now Ed Perkins had no military background, as far as I know, but you know, Colin Powell and I both came out of the same uniform, and the thing that you are taught from day one in the military is that when you're at the top of the pyramid, never forget, it's all those people at the bottom of the pyramid who are holding you up there. You take care of them first. I mean, there's an ironclad rule that every second lieutenant learns, is you feed the troops first. And so, you know, all of that gets brought to a leadership position. I mean, if you've been in a situation where you've been insulted because of, you know, the color of your skin, and you know how that feels, then you're going to be aware of that when you're dealing with people. And that, it doesn't mean, you know, I've had to fire people, I've had to discipline people, but there's a way to do it. You know, I was always taught that you always leave people with their dignity. And as Jimmy Carter learned, you don't even corner a rabbit. You don't push people into a corner, because when you do, they only have two choices: curl up and die or fight back. And if you're a leader, those are two very bad choices to force your people to make. What you want to do is make it a learning experience, and make it such that even if they've done something wrong, they know that you care about them and you'll try to help them do better. And I think, you know, at least that's what I felt that I brought to leadership positions, and that's a positive. And I think anyone who's been on the receiving end of bad treatment, most normal people would feel that way. But lost your mic. There you go.
There you go. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I need to leave time for questions from the so many participants that are out there. So I'm going to curtail some of my points that I want to make, or questions. But I want to thank you for letting us kind of virtually walk in your shoes a bit this evening, Ambassador, and for all that you are personally doing to contribute to our national and international conversation on race and justice. And thank you to WorldDenver for expanding the conversation and helping us to promote durable change here in America. I saw a protest sign which read, "More Mayberry, less Fallujah." And I think a lot of diplomats would agree with that sentiment. And I just want to leave it at that for now. And let's take some questions, John.
Yes, and thank you again for that conversation. And I do want to bring the audience in and hear some of your perspective. So if you have questions, you can click again on the question icon on your control panel, and we'll try to get to a few of those if we can. I will start with a question for both Ambassador Ray and Ambassador Ebert-Gray. We heard last week, we had a program with the diplomat in residence, Scott Smith, and he talked a little bit about how the role of a diplomat is to always carry forward the mission and the policies and the objectives of the US government, regardless of whether you agree. So you put aside your personal beliefs, your kind of personal thoughts, and you don't evaluate necessarily what those policies are, but you carry them forward and you make them your own. Can you both talk a little bit about that tension, particularly when we know that, you know, governments aren't perfect, administrations aren't perfect, policies aren't perfect, and when you've had to have a choice between your own personal belief and what was the official mission or policy of either the military or of the diplomatic corps?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll take a stab at that. No, you're right, and this is true whether you're in the military or in the diplomatic service. Your oath says that you will follow the instructions, or in the military, the orders of those above you, and that you carry out the policies faithfully, whether you agree with them or not. And I don't really, to me, I don't have a conflict with that. I've had to carry out missions or policies that I didn't completely agree with on a number of occasions. What you have to do, I think, is know what is my sense of integrity. If there's a mission that absolutely crosses my red line of I just don't do things like that, then I would resign. I mean, I'm fortunate that in my 30 years, 50 years, that never happened. If it's just that I disagree, I mean, first of all, you have to be realistic and accept that you might not be right. I mean, that's your point of view. The people who've been elected have come up with this, and this is supposedly represents the will of the majority of the American people, so you carry it out. Depending on where you are in the food chain, though, I mean, there's what I call workarounds. And I'll give you an example. Our reaction to the International Criminal Court, I didn't disagree with the reasons we didn't want to be part of the ICC. I did vehemently disagree with the way we went about getting other countries to agree with us. It was basically coercion. You know, agree not to refer Americans to the ICC or we will cut aid. So as ambassador, when I received the instruction to go to the government of Cambodia with this offer, okay, yeah, I mean, this is probably might be a better way of doing it, but in a certain sense, they're right. There were countries that might try to use the ICC as a propaganda tool against the U.S. So when I approached the government, instead of following the explicit instructions that I got, you know, go to them and say, we want you to do this, and if you don't do this, here's what we're going to do. I gave them a little description of the U.S. justice system and the fact that it would prosecute Americans who violate the laws of war, who commit crimes against humanity, and therefore we didn't need to send Americans to the International Criminal Court. And it would be really a nice gesture if that country would acknowledge that, and if they could make this agreement. And of course, now they knew what my instructions were. I mean, none of these things are, because other embassies were approaching their governments and basically just following instructions and getting some fairly predictable reactions. I mean, in a couple of cases, the ambassadors were basically told to get the heck spelled with double hockey sticks out of the foreign minister's office. But I think they appreciated that I didn't hit them with this little bit of extortion. And so the government immediately agreed and we signed the agreement. And I sent notice back to Washington. I've signed the agreement with the foreign ministry, and they were happy. I didn't bother going into an explanation of how I modified their instructions to get the agreement done, which I didn't think I had to. I mean, basically, when I was in the Army, you were told to complete a mission. As long as you didn't break a law, all they were concerned with is the mission was accomplished. And that's how I that's how I approach that. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. If there's a policy you disagree with, just because I wouldn't do it that way, well, too bad. When you get elected president, then you can make the policy, but otherwise you carry it out. If it's a policy that I feel is morally reprehensible, that it's just wrong. If it's illegal, you don't do it. I was once asked by a member of Congress to literally kidnap 2 young girls and put them on a plane and send them to the U.S. And I basically told him, not no, but you know what, no. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer to a short question, but the point is, yes, your job is to carry out the policies decided by the elected leadership as long as it's legal. And if it is immoral, if you just feel that completely violates your sense of what's morally right, then you resign, because those are the only options. Those are the only, in my view, acceptable options. I'm sorry, Catherine, I didn't mean to take up so much time, but.
Well, I'll just take a minute. And I have to say that I thoroughly respect colleagues who end up resigning because they can't sleep at night thinking about things. But it is an organization that you are changing your location, your supervisors, your peers, your subordinates, your schools and everything every couple of years, not unlike the military. So you learn to be quite adaptable. And both of us have worked for 6 or 7 secretaries of state, several presidents of the United States, and we're also representing the American people. So a lot of our job is educational, as he described. And I know myself, when it came to climate change, they understood that our policy was shifting, but I was able to talk about the innovative products the U.S. was still delivering, about our tsunami warning center, about our weather training, about our USAID assistance. You can come up with lots of ways you can put things and frame it to educate your partners in a bilateral relationship. But also, they can all put things in context because they're seeing what's happening in America. So it's not as difficult as you might think, and it can be tricky. You've got to be thinking about things, but it's part of the job.
Thank you. And as a kind of closing question and comment, one that's been asked a few times, a few different ways. So as you mentioned, Ambassador Ray, change comes from the top. I think many of us who are interested in seeing more diverse and representative foreign service want to see that change happen, but feel like it's impossible for us outside of that organization to make change. So it's a 2-part question, and one that I'll invite you both to chime in on. One is, what can we do? And 2 is, what should Secretary Pompeo do? So if you were in his shoes, what would be some policies right off the bat that could institute some change in the State Department?
Ambassador Ebert-Gray, I'll let you go first this time.
Thank you. And I appreciate that question very much. And what goes through my mind is kind of, first of all, I think we have to start at a younger age. Why aren't we going into grade schools and high schools to talk about diplomacy and talk about the path towards that type of a career? And that's why I'm so excited to be working at the University of Colorado, Denver, because that's part of my job too, is to create opportunities for global education. But I think we need to start younger. I think reaching people when they're already in college or older than that makes it a little more challenging. So that would be one thing. Also, we need to use the tools that we have to get out and to get into communities where we can find the talent we need to diversify. The military's done it very successfully.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I would also say that we spend a lot of time chasing numbers. I mean, I have this aversion to becoming a slave to metrics, and so we looked at diversity as we have to recruit a diverse array of candidates, and it's true, we do, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, because if you're going to have a diverse diplomatic service, you have to ensure that diversity works its way all the way from the entry level up to the top, and across all of the specialties. And what's missing and where the leadership needs to take a hand is ensuring, for example, that assignments, promotions, training opportunities, mentoring is made available to all members of the Foreign Service, specialists and Foreign Service officers and civil service alike, to ensure that they feel that they belong to and are a part of that organization. I mean, the way the Foreign Service is now, they look at diversity when they're recruiting, they throw you through A100 and they toss you into the shark pool and you're just told to swim. And that is not how you, that's not how you build a diverse organization. You have to nurture people all the way through the system. I mean, one of the things that's missing in the Foreign Service and in the State Department, we have fairly good vocational training. I mean, we're like vocational training in high school. You know, it's for the people who aren't going to go to college. What we don't have is an education system that focuses on building Foreign Service practitioners. We build great econ officers, we build great political officers, but we don't have that overarching educational system that builds good Foreign Service practitioners regardless of their specialty. When you join the Army, and whether you're going to be career enlisted or an officer, you get your specific skill training, but you also get throughout your career education designed to build you up, not as an infantryman or as an artilleryman, but as a soldier, as a member of a professional cadre of people. And you know, put aside whether you're wearing a red scarf or a blue scarf, and that's a, you know, the different, I don't know if they even do it anymore, but in my day, each branch of the service in the Army had its own color, and when you wore your scarf, people could immediately tell which branch you belonged to. But when the bugle sounds, when the flag goes up, you're just a soldier. That's all you are, and you're trained from the day you come in as a private until the day you retire at whatever rank. Even 4-star generals are required to have certain education until they retire. And we're missing that. We're lacking that in the State Department. And if I were the Secretary of State, I mean, that would be a priority issue. Build an education system that educates foreign affairs practitioners, and build a structure that nurtures people from cradle to grave.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to both Ambassador Kathleen Ebert-Gray and Ambassador Charles Ray. I think it's so evident the love that you have for these institutions that you continue to want to help to improve them. Thank you also to everyone who joined us this evening. You know, this is WorldDenver's 16th virtual event since March, and each event takes staff time. It takes time by our board, our volunteer speakers committee, and of course our speakers and our moderators to prepare and put on and to have these really important and timely conversations. So we will come back again in 3 weeks with Ambassador Elam Thomas for a conversation on hidden figures, women in diplomacy. And that is a conversation that will be moderated by Denver community leader and activist Tina Walls. I encourage everyone who's with us tonight, if you're not yet a member of WorldDenver, to check us out at worlddenver.org and to become a member and to support this programming as we continue to provide it and try to keep these conversations going even while we're in isolation. Thank you so much, and one more time, to our speaker, to our moderator, and Ambassador Charles Ray. You're always welcome here in Denver once we're able to get you here.
I look forward to it.
Everyone, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.